Hello and welcome to Effective Communication. So just a brief reminder as well that this is obviously for informational purposes only. Do not copy it. When you're giving your answers, make sure you give your answers in full. Let's refrain from using bullet points, and obviously link it into practice, link it into when you have demonstrated good communication skills, whether that's with the young people, whether that's with the staff members, and where applicable, if you can link in theoretical approaches, legislations or theories, please do. So the first question we're going to be looking at is describe methods of communication and the reasons why people communicate. There is obviously a few different methods of communication. We've got the most obvious one, which is verbal. So obviously this is spoken words, having conversations. That can obviously be in phone calls as well. We've got written communication, such as text messages, emails, letters, memos. We've got visual communication, such as graphs, charts, presentations, pictures, things like that. We have got digital communication, such as social media, video conferencing, instant messages, obviously things like Teams that we use quite regularly. We've got interpersonal communication, so face-to-face conversations, meetings and networking. And last but not least, on this section is non-verbal communication. So body language, eye contact. These are probably the most important, because even when you're using verbal communication, you will be actually using a lot of non-verbal communication as well. But we'll pick this apart a little bit later on. So why do we communicate? Well, there's so many reasons why we communicate. We communicate to make decisions. We communicate to understand and to be understood, to share our opinions, to share our experiences, to share knowledge, to share and explain our emotions, to give to express our sort of our feelings and our needs, and to give reaction to information that we have been given. But I've just put on here as well, give an example of why we communicate. What do we use to communicate? Maybe you've used a really good example of communicating with your body language, with facial expressions, to try and get across some form of communication. So try and use an example. So this is explain factors contributing to effective communication. So when you are supporting a young person and you are communicating with them, there is lots of different ways of communicating, as we well know. So to be able to deliver effective communication, you've got to recognise the circumstances. So the tone of which you're talking to, first of all, when you're communicating, if you're using verbal communication, we've got to be really mindful of the tone that we're using. At the moment in time, I suppose, really good example is I'm really mindful of my tone. As I'm demonstrating here through this presentation, I'm mindful because I don't want to have a monotone voice. So I'm being really mindful of the tone of my voice whilst presenting to you. But think about your tone of your voice when you're communicating with a child or young person. You must also be thinking about their age as well, and what you're trying to communicate relevant to their age. Again, age is a number, isn't it? We know that. We could have a 15-year-old in front of us, we could be trying to communicate with them, but we have to take into consideration the capacity of that child. So they may well be 15, but they may well have a capacity of a 11-year-old or a 10-year-old. So therefore, you're going to have to adapt your level of communication relevant to that. We have to be really mindful of our range. I've just given an example of that. The loudness, the pace. Again, I'm being really mindful of the pace of how I talk right now. It's really important as well that it's really important that we're mindful of our body language when we're communicating. I think sometimes that we tend to forget the importance of how we communicate through our expressions, our physical expressions. So when you're communicating to a child, you could well have a great tone, you could be got a great level, you could have a really relaxed approach. But if you're trying to ask a young person to engage with you, but your body language is telling them that you're interested in your phone, or you're interested in what's on TV, or you're too busy interested in what's going on in the next room because you're trying to listen, but still trying to talk to this young person, that will speak volumes. And the young people that you are taking care of have an unbelievable ability to be able to read body language. Some of them, it's been their surviving techniques for many years, for many and many occasions. So when we are demonstrating effective communication, think about how you're actually delivering this communication. So you've also got to take into consideration as well is your energy that you're giving off. If you're giving off positive or negative energy, that is a really important one as well. So that's how that's all different levels of communication, how you might communicate. So what I want you to think about as well is think about all the tools that you use within your job role to communicate, to demonstrate effective communication. You obviously communicate with the young people and the children, you communicate with your staff members. So what sort of tools do you use to demonstrate really good communication? Things such as you might have a communication log, you will have your handover, that's a big communication tool. You will have possibly a diary. You will have, some of you have like an intranet system, so like Liquid Logic or ClearPoint or ClearCare, I think it's ClearCare. So there is a multitude of tools that you use on a daily basis. A form of communication with a young person is you will maybe do a key working session or an engagement session, but you will document that on either the young person's file or on the intranet, and you will hand it over to the staff members, especially if that key working session has been really important. So when answering this question, ensure that you're giving a really good example of effective communication, and also just reflect on some of the tools that you might use as well. I've just put some additional bits up here as well. Effective communication will also support you to have consistency. It's obviously important to demonstrate active listening as well. Being able to read those non-verbal cues is a really good way of being able to demonstrate effective communication. I said earlier, didn't I, about you could be talking to a young person and trying to engage with them, but too busy listening about the conversation, what's happening in the next room. So you've got to be mindful of then reading your non-verbal cues, but also on the flip side, you've got to be able to read theirs as well. It will also support a number of things, such as having that openness and transparency. You're going to be able to build trust. You'll be able to demonstrate empathy and emotional intelligence whilst doing so. So when you're doing it, consider and incorporate these factors into your communication, your practice. And this also demonstrates even more effective communication. So describe why in certain situations a child or a young person may be unable to use verbal communication. There is a number of reasons why a child or a young person may not be able to use verbal communication. Age and development stages. Again, I spoke earlier about capacity. There is a number of cases of where there has been children that have been so severely neglected that they have not developed, they've not learned how to speak because their brain's not developed properly because of the neglect. You've obviously got physical disabilities that can have a massive impact on being able to communicate verbally, trauma and emotional distress. So we know that some people, if they've suffered so significant trauma, they may not be able to communicate at that point in time. They may find it very difficult to be able to express any form of emotions or communication due to sort of fear and anxiety around what they've experienced. It could be environmental factors, if it's a bit noisy or very chaotic, again, a child may be less likely to communicate verbally. We've got speech and language disorders, medical conditions, you've got learning disabilities, cultural differences as well. So if they don't speak the same language, that will be a massive factor as well. Selective mutism, so when a child is choosing not to speak, again, probably due to trauma, neglect, abuse. Obviously, you've got autism, that is a big one as well. Shyness and having that social anxiety, and it could just be an individual personal trait for the child or young person. So when you remember when you're answering the questions, if you can give an example, do give an example. So this question asks, explain how effective communication benefits relationship and best practice. Now, this is a really good opportunity to be able to give these examples, because I would be utterly confident that you will have an example of this during your working practice. But effective communication is vital for positive relationships, both personally and professionally in a work setting. Clear communication builds trust, promotes understanding, resolves conflict, enhances collaboration, boosts morale, and increases productivity. Best practice includes active listening. Active listening is, that is one of the things that, again, probably we don't pay attention to too much. I gave you the example the other day earlier on about, being there when you're communicating. And it's the same for when they're communicating with you. If a young person's trying to talk to you, show them that you're listening. So listening, I'm the worst one in the world. I can be in a room and I can listen to a conversation and I can be doing 6 other things at the same time. So when I was working with the children, I had to make it really apparent that I had to stop everything I was doing and actually show them I was listening. Even though I knew I was listening, I could still hear. I can hear so many things going on all at once. So demonstrating that active listening is really important. Being clear and concise. Interact with the communication as well. So, giving some form of interaction will again demonstrate that you actually listen to the conversation. Demonstrating again cultural sensitivity, and also keeping, well, there's lots of things, but keeping a positive language as well, being mindful of your language, and all of these plus more will demonstrate best practice. So, like I said earlier, do try and give an example. The thing is, I know you all know how to communicate. I know you do. I've seen it firsthand. But what I need you to do is, when you're answering these questions, is really delve in to the details of the communication that you deliver. So when you're talking about, I had a key working session with a young person, talk about the logistics of that key work. Talk about, we made sure that we were in the lounge, there was no distractions, the TV was off. I was really mindful of that. I sat with my body language facing them. So when you're writing the answers, do give that detail. When you give detail like that, it will stretch the answer very far. So please ensure you do. So the next question is going to be, describe barriers to communication and their impact on relationships. So we've got linguistic barriers. So we've got language barriers, psychological barriers, and physical barriers. But first of all, what is a barrier? I'm sure you know what a barrier is, but a barrier is anything that prevents a communication from being understood. The first barrier you need to consider is anything that you might be putting up. Despite your best efforts facilitating communication, make sure you aren't making it difficult for others to understand what you are saying. Linguistic barriers. So you've got to stay clear of the lingo, shall I say, and your vocabulary. It's really important that you are talking to the young people without any sort of professional slang words or buzzwords or anagrams, things like that. Acronyms. I say anagrams for, I don't know, but acronyms, again, big ones. Also, be mindful of accents. I've worked with a few staff members that have really strong accents. I find it really difficult to understand. I've worked with one particular staff member, and his accent was so strong, I would find myself nodding along with them because I didn't understand what they said. And I felt like there was only so many times that I could say, sorry, I don't understand. What did you say? So be really, really mindful of that as well. On the flip side as well, the young person could be talking to you in slang. They could be from an area of where they're talking, I don't want to say gang slang, but where they're talking about, oh, it's totally gassed, and that is a real linguistic barrier, because if you don't know what these words mean, quite simply you could get confused with what's happening throughout the conversation. It's been a while since I've been in residential, so and I know that there's a lot of children that have come up from London, and when I was there, I had to learn what these words meant. Also as well, because there is a lot of slang words that actually mean words that are risky words. Excuse me. So we've also got language barriers. So again, you may have a young person. I think there's a lot of refugees at the moment going into some of these homes. So there might be a massive language barrier. So you've got to think about how you're going to try and overcome that, or at least support and manage it. So you've got psychological barriers. So a young person could be on medication. They could be on substances, so be using substances such as cannabis, alcohol, things like that. Therefore, it will actually have an impact on their ability to be able to communicate, which can be proved tricky if they have been intoxicated and you're trying to check on their welfare. And then obviously you've got physical barriers. So all of those barriers are quite apparent, but sometimes I think we do tend to not really pay attention to what the physical barriers could be. I said earlier about obviously giving the examples of being in a room and communicating. If you're trying to communicate with a young person and they're in another room, if their bedroom door's shut and you're trying to ask them to, what do you want for dinner, or let them know dinner's ready, and so on and so forth, straight away you've got that barrier. The bedroom door's closed, or you're talking through a wall, or the TV's blaring out in the background, or the radio's on when you're trying to talk, or there's a conversation going on in the next room. It's really, 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 really important to be mindful of that. Also, what about the room temperature? Do you think the room temperature can impact a form of communication? Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. You know what it's like if you're really hot yourself, you're really uncomfortable, you're very distracted, you're not able to, perhaps even, you probably don't want to hold a conversation, to be fair, if you're really hot and bothered. So be mindful of the temperature in the room. Also as well is, when we're looking at the physical environment, look at the room that you are in. Is it too busy? Is it too distracting? Is there too many pictures going on? Is there toys out on the floor? Toys might help you, we don't know, but you've got to think about all of these dynamics because they do have an impact. You know, if you just, I know working with my own children, if I'm trying to communicate with them, one of the biggest things that I found works, and obviously it's a bit difficult when you're looking after children in the care sector because obviously you've got to be mindful of this. But one thing I noticed is when I'm trying to communicate with my children is I actually have to make physical contact with them. I actually have to touch them on the shoulder to be able to get them to recognize that I am communicating with them. So having a physical barrier in the way, such as being in a different room or even being down the corridor, is too much in that instance because I have to have that contact with them. So really absorb this because I know you're going to know about all of these, but when you're answering the questions, give these examples because these examples are going to demonstrate your understanding on it. So I've spoken about all of the barriers now, and I've given you some examples of the impacts of them. So, you know, the impact of obviously being in a different room, the communication's not going to go through. The impact of a child or a young person speaking a different language is going to make the child feel very uneasy. I mean, I would be actually quite frightened. I mean, if you put yourself in their shoes, you're in a house full of English speaking people and you speak a completely different language. You're going to feel isolated. You're going to feel alone. You're going to feel all those things. So all of those barriers are going to actually have some form of negative impact. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at how to reduce them. So the next question is, how can you reduce these barriers? So let's have a look at it a bit more realistic. If you have got a barrier such as a physical one, such as the young person's in a room, you're trying to communicate and the TV's on, can we turn the TV off? Is it a bit too busy in that room? Is the room a bit too colourful? Is there too many things that are going to distract them? Is there noise going on in the next room? Let's move into a different room. Let's look at the language barriers. Okay, well, we've got this language barrier. What are we going to use? Google Translate. What about some pictures? What about if we start putting some pictures and words around the house on specific items, such as a cup, such as a cupboard, so we can start to try and educate them on the basic things. We are going to educate ourselves as well. It's not just about them. We have to educate ourselves as well. So we might need to do a little bit of research on that language to find out the basics to be able to communicate. Linguistic barriers, speak to them, get them to teach you about the slang, get them to teach you about all the in words at the moment, so you can actually communicate. They'll laugh at you, but you know what? That's another way of building these relationships up. We've also got to be really mindful of the learning disabilities or the barriers as well. Like I said earlier, my son, if I have to communicate with him, I have to have contact with him. I have to actually get some level of eye contact again as well. But when we're doing this, we are, remember, treating these young people as individuals. So eye contact might work for one child, it might not work for the other. So we're going to try and reduce these barriers. If we're looking at the accents I said earlier, if you have a strong accent, be mindful of that accent, slow it down, break it down or break it up, make it clearer for them to understand. If it's really strong I mean, you can read body language. You can read if you're trying to communicate and the young person's looking at you with a puzzled look on their face. So what we're going to do, we'll draw pictures, we'll explain ourselves with gestures. You know, this is how you're going to be able to break it down. Obviously, I've put some more examples up on screen as well. So how you're going to reduce them using that positive language, getting yourself some training. Oh, also as well with the language barriers, when you're using Google Translate, evidently speaking, get a translator in. Get that translator in. We're going to move on to that in the next question, but seeking out that sort of translator, especially when you've got these big reviews coming up, because the child needs to be able to have an understanding. It's their reviews, it's their life, so we need to be able to support them how we can. I just started on that. So the next question is how to access support or services. I just made a start on that. Language barrier. We are going to bring in a translator. So if we've got a child or a young person that's got perhaps learning difficulties or they've got disabilities, we might have to bring in a speech therapist. I was actually working with one of my learners the other day who they did a presentation for something, and it was on speech and speech therapy. It is so interesting. I learned so much more than I knew about speech and language therapists. You automatically assume that it's about teaching them vocabulary, teaching them how to talk, but it's about each even interacting with the communication. And one thing that stood out to me, what she said was taking it in turns, teaching the child or young person to take it in turns, being able to sit still for a little bit to be able to have that conversation. So you're going to bring in that sort of support where needed. It's our responsibility to ensure that these children do get this support. It's not fair, and we're not adhering to we have a duty of care. So we have to adhere to our duty of care to make sure that support services are in place should that child or young person need it. It could be very simple. If there is such a strong accent or in the home, it could simply be a change of face. But we are going to seek out this support. So have a little think about it. Think about other supports that you can use. Obviously, you've got counselling, psychologists, things like that. But give your understanding of how you would support a young person. So the next question is describe good practice of conflict solving. So good conflict resolution involves open communication. You've got to have a level of empathy. You've got to stay calm, trying to seek that common ground, and you've got to do some problem solving. You're going to have to establish some ground rules at first, and try and use some form of reflection. So let's put this into real time. So if you've got two young people, I'm going to use the young people for an example. If you've got two young people, which it will happen at some point in your career, there will be a conflict between them. It's bound to happen because of all these young people who all lived under the same roof, or all living under the same roof and all come from different backgrounds. So there is going to be conflict, and the children as well. How are you dealing with this conflict? So let's look at it from the child's perspective. What did I used to do? Well, it depends on the level of conflict. Now, if the level of conflict was not too aggressive, it was a bit of an argument, I would allow it to happen. We cannot always intervene when it's low key, low stages. Do not, I would not intervene. I would allow the conflict to happen. Why? Why would I do that? Because when the adults, we deal with conflict all the time. You walk into a supermarket, you've accidentally pushed in the queue by accident, you've got conflict. You have taken someone's driving spot at the car park, you've got conflict. There's going to be conflict at work. There's going to be conflict everywhere, unfortunately, they go in their lives. So stepping back and allowing that conflict to happen is a good method, because they need to learn how to manage this. Now, if it's going to the next stage where it's getting a little bit too much, it's getting a bit too heated, how are you going to manage that? You're probably going to come in and try and diffuse it. You'll try and diffuse it. You may take one of the young people off. You may go give them a bit of chill out time. Another staff member might take the other person off. So you're going to come in and diffuse the situation and try and calm it. If it's gone on to the next stage, where there has been a real conflict happen, where they have been at loggerheads, you're obviously going to come in and intervene. You are going to come in and intervene, and you're going to separate them, and you're going to go give them their cooling off period. What are we going to do now? What are we going to do? They've got two young people living under the same roof. They could have had a mild conflict, but they've absolutely got the ump with each other. They could have had a really bad conflict, and they're just refusing to engage with each other. So the next stage for me would be to offer mediation. And this is where what I've just said earlier comes into effect. Right, we're going to have mediation. We're going to have an impartial person in there. We're going to talk about this. We're going to put in some ground rules, first of all. We're going to take it in turns, one after another. And what we're going to do is we're going to let that person finish talking before we start talking. You are going to give them that time to solve the actual problem. When I was working in the home with girls, you have no idea how much conflict there was over clothes. You know, they'd lend each other clothes and then they want their clothes back. Can I borrow your hair straighteners? Yeah, sure, borrow my hair straighteners. I want my hair straighteners back. It was constant, absolute constant conflict. But it was manageable conflict at that time. There was one particular time where the conflict went to the next stage, and this is what we did. We did a mediation. So mediations can be really effective. Even if they don't make friends, it's important for them to be able to articulate themselves in that safe space. Otherwise, this feud will potentially drag on further. So once you've answered that question about conflict, again, you may well have had a really good example of that. So please do pop that down. So the next question is define the term confidentiality. Now, this is one of the biggest things that you have to do on a daily basis. So let's have a look at what this means. What is confidentiality? So confidentiality is the principle or the ethical practice of keeping information, data, communication private, secure, and preventing unauthorized access or disclosure to individuals or entitles authorized to have that information. Not authorized, sorry. In a nutshell, we just don't share it. If we are completing, let's have a look, if we're completing some private information for the young person, maybe we're doing some work on the computer, we are going to make sure that that office door is shut. We're going to make sure that there's no young people can see what you're talking about. If you're having a conversation on the phone, you are going to make sure again that you're in a private space. When we're sharing information with other professionals, we share on a need to know basis. Who needs to know this information? Who's permitted to know this information? Why do we do this? Obviously, it's about respecting the young person as well. That's a big factor. But we do this to adhere to data protection. So here's some of the legislations that you're following. You're following the confidentiality legislation and the data protection, which is the data protection legislation, and the GDPR. We have to do this. This is a legal part of our jobs. So think about how you do that. So first of all, I just said you've got to obviously respect the young person's wishes and feelings. So we may have to seek permission on sharing some information, sometimes dependent on the dynamics, but sometimes a young person may request you not to share something with, I don't know, their parents sometimes, or their nan or their gran or their brothers or their sisters. Dependent on the situation, of course, we can respect their wishes. It can be very difficult because of sometimes we have to share information that they don't want to be shared with other professionals. So why might we do this? For safety purposes. When we've got to safeguard a child or a young person, we will have to share relevant information with other professionals. So in a nutshell, when you're looking at the GDPR and data protection legislation, even though these legislations are in place and we have to adhere to them, when it comes to the safety of the child, when you are keeping that child safe, you can effectively share information with people to keep that child safe. It kind of, I want to say the word trumps, but if you need to share to keep the child safe, you kind of breach the Data Protection Act, because safeguarding is paramount. It is the most important thing. So the next question will be explaining the boundaries of your own role. So what I want you to do is I want you to give me examples of how you do this. I said earlier about it being in the office locked away. I know a lot of you use Liquid Logic or ClearCare. They're password protected. If you are completing any documentation, you try and prevent from taking it out of the office. If you are completing any emails, you're going to make sure that you are only using the young person's initials. If you are making phone calls or having phone conversations, you're going to be really mindful of your surroundings, and also as well being mindful of who's calling into the home. I've had a couple of occasions where I've had phone calls come into the home and they've started to ask me really bizarre questions, and I haven't answered them. I've just very simply said, I really do apologise, but this information I cannot share with you right now. And I've ended the call because I didn't know who they were. It ended up being somebody relevant, but I didn't know who they were. So I ended the call and said, sorry, it's not information I can share with you right now. So when you answer this question, give examples of how you adhere to confidentiality and the importance of keeping a child safe. So sharing that information, even if it's breaching that confidentiality, to keep that child safe. So the next question you've got is describe your responsibilities in relation to confidentiality and disclosures by a child or a young person. So I kind of started to talk about this in the last slide. So professionals must balance confidentiality with ensuring the safety and well-being of the children. Disclosure decisions should be prioritise the best interests of the child or the young person. So pretty much what I just said a minute ago. When it comes to a disclosure, your priority is to keep that child safe. So if you've got a disclosure and you have to share it with the police, if you have to share it with the social worker, which obviously you will do it in a specific manner. You may well get some form of informed consent. Obviously, if there's safeguarding concerns, you just got to do it. You're going to document everything that you're doing. You may well need to offer some form of support and guidance to the child or young person. So, they've made a disclosure. You're going to have to explain to them, listen, I know you've disclosed this to me, but I have to share this with your social worker, or I have to share this with the police. It's my duty of care to keep you safe. I'm going to have to, share it with these people. So you're going to have to support them. You're going to have to help them to probably go through a really tough time. but by doing so, we're going to establish trust. You know, that's the hope in the game, is that we're going to establish and build a relationship. So again, where relevant, communicating with their parents or carers. Again, that's dependent on their section, their care order. It depends on the consent of contact or information sharing with their parents at the time. It's what's relevant. And obviously in a crisis situation, when you are in crisis and you do not know what you've got to do, you still share. You share with who you need to share with. If a child has made a disclosure and you're not quite sure of, you know, who to share it with or what to do next, you share it with your next person above you, your manager. If your manager's not there, then you're going to phone on call. You are going to seek some form of guidance with this. I'm not saying that if there's a disclosure made, you stand on a rooftop and shout it out to every person walking by, obviously not. But we need to prioritise the safety of the child. Or they could well have made a disclosure about another child. We need to still prioritise the safety of that child. So the next question is, explain the conflict between maintaining confidentiality and disclosing concerns. The conflict between maintaining confidentiality and disclosing concerns arises when you are faced with the ethical dilemma of keeping the information private or to share the information. I've said to you earlier, sometimes you may come across a disclosure and you're in that situation of, because some children disclose in really unusual ways, sometimes they can disclose through pictures, sometimes they can disclose through actions, sometimes they can make disclosures through, I had one that they were watching telly and they started to make a disclosure, but they were using the telly, the program we were watching on TV, to roundabout way tell me this situation. So I couldn't really understand what they were saying, and I was really baffled by what had just happened. And it was that point where I was trying to process, is this a disclosure or is this not? What do I do with this information? So I reported it. I raised it. I raised it with my manager. It was raised onto the social worker. Evidently speaking, it ended up being a disclosure that the social worker and the police have been waiting for a while, actually. But it's that level of, you are going to probably have to break the trust of the child. You know, when we're trained in taking disclosures, one of the hardest things I struggled to get my head around was, if a child's making disclosure, they advise you, and I spoke to someone the other day actually, and they said it's apparently still relevant, but they advise you to, where possible, if the child's making a disclosure, to advise them that any information that you're going to share with me, I will have to share with professionals. I understand that, I fully do understand that, but it can really cause a problem. The child might stop disclosing. If you're not able to get that you know that sort of expression across to the child, and they have made a disclosure, and at the end of the disclosure, you're going to turn around and say, I really appreciate that you've shared this information with me. However, I am going to go and write this up, and I'm going to go and notify your social worker. That could have an impact on your relationship. It could certainly make the child or young person upset. It could break down that trust. It could break down that relationship. It could make the child feel sad. It could make them feel embarrassed. It could make them feel regretful. It could make them feel, you know, they're going to be frightened. There's going to be so many things. So therefore, with this, you may but start seeing some of the behaviours. So there is a lot of conflict, and you've got to be really mindful of when you're taking disclosure of who you're going to share this information with, and also educating that child and being prepared to support them, because it's going to be a very tough situation. Some of you may go through your whole career and you may not experience this. Others, you may well have already experienced it. So it is a really sensitive topic. So when you're answering this question, if you have got an example, please do give it. And obviously, let me remind you, if you are given an example, please ensure that you are keeping confidentiality when you're writing about a child or a young person. Do not share their names with me. But yeah, give an example where possible. Why is it important to share information and have agreed goals in place when partnership working? So having these agreed goals with all of the people that you are working with, all of the professionals, is going to give that collaborative approach. It's going to be able to offer a holistic approach. It's going to be able to offer, being able to allocate those resources that you may need. It's also going to be able to enhance that decision making a good choice. You know that you do strategy meetings for these kids. You have to, because you have to get a number of professionals involved with these strategy meetings, because by having these professionals involved, you're going to be able to make a better choice and to be able to support the young person to evidently get positive outcomes. Is to build, obviously, trust in relationships. It gives a much better opportunity to be able to solve problems. Having, we always said, didn't we, 2 heads is better than 1. And it's true. If you've got yourselves that work really closely with the young people, you've got a social worker who's qualified as a, got a degree in social work, you've got a psychologist in there, you've got the school have given you some information about it as well. You've got the parents that might have given you information. You might have the police in there that's given you info. All of these people involved are going to be able to offer a lot more of a holistic approach and be able to give the opportunity to give the children the actual support that they need, because every single person in that room is educated in their own professional field and have a certain level of knowledge. Social workers, obviously, there to support the child, but they have a greater understanding perhaps than what we do of the parents backgrounds. The police will have a greater understanding of the parents, especially if the parents have been involved in some form of crime themselves or drug abuse. So the police will have a different level of understanding. So it's really important to have this collaborative approach. You've got to be able to do it. One of the biggest things that they're going to want to hear throughout this whole qualification and in your final exams is this multi-agency approach. Multi-agency is one of the key words. We will go into it a little bit later in the qualification when we start talking about working as a team. But the Children's Act 2004 piece of legislation was brought in to ensure multi-agency was being used to support children. So you've reached the end of the session. Hopefully you have made good use of this. Again, just to remind you, make sure you answer the questions in full. Do not use bullet points, as this will not meet the criteria. And where possible, put some examples into your practice as well. Thank you for attending.